He's speaking with us today about a toolkit for promoting your own healing. Dr. A. Kinderliner, MD, is a nationally recognized physician with expertise in the fields of nutrition, allergy, environmental medicine, Lyme disease, and the healing of mind, body, spirit as a unified whole. Dr. Kinderliner is a co-founder of the New England Center for Holistic Medicine in Newbury, Massachusetts, and has taught extensively, including practitioner training courses at the Omega Institute, the National Institute of Behavioral Medicine, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, and the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society. He created and organized the Lyme Fundamental Courses, which is presented annually at the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society Conference. He is the author of many articles in the Medical Journal and in the Lyme Times. His integrated medical practices here in our backyard, Denver, Colorado, and he focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of tick-borne illnesses. Dr. Kinderliner, is the author of Recovering from Lyme Disease, the Integrative Medicine Guide to the Diagnosis and Treatment of Tick-Borne Illnesses. This was released in March 2021. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. K. Handing this over to you.
Thanks so much, Jody. And thanks to Joanne, Jody, Monica for making this happen. I know it's a lot of work, but I think it's a great service. And thank you, Joe. You always do a fantastic job. I just want to say I'm personally indebted to Joe. He was he continues to be one of my mentors. Someone I call on, and he's just a great colleague. And always a wealth of information and a wonderful attitude. So, okay, I am going to pull up my PowerPoint. Oh, geez, let's see. Hold on. Allow Zoom to share your screen. You know, this is, let's see, I think we got it. We got it.
All right, good. Okay, good.
All right, it did something weird on me. Okay, so a toolkit for promoting your own healing. You're probably wondering, what's this about? I will explain shortly after this slide. Here we're going through airport security. This is my wife, by the way. Lyme disease, huh?
Hey, Dr. K, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm not seeing your, I'm not seeing it.
Eesh. Okay.
So sorry.
Neither.
Okay. Wow. I'm
going to make you, I'm making you a co-host just in case that is what we need to do. So let me try that.
Okay.
And now give it a shot.
Okay, let's see. This is, let's see if this does it. Is anything coming up now?
No.
Okay, right now, Jody, what I'm looking at is a few dozen people, okay? Just their names. Usually I see at this point just myself, because when I try to share the screen, what's coming up is very different from what I usually see. I'm not seeing, usually it goes to just a home thing, and then I can choose my PowerPoint.
If you look at the bottom of your screen, can you see a green icon that says share screen?
Yes,
Hit that.
That's what I'm doing.
And it's still not letting you, huh?
Well, when I hit, it's different. Like I said, this looks different. It says Microsoft PowerPoint, great. And then it's giving me the option. It says open system preferences. I'm not sure.
That is odd.
Very odd.
Do you want to just quickly send it to me and I can share it while you talk through it?
Okay, let's try that.
Sorry, everybody, for these technical difficulties. This happens sometimes with our virtual platforms. So just give us one moment and we'll get started.
Okay, so Jody. Jody at coloradotix.org, yeah?
Perfect. Yep. And then I'll go ahead and share it, and then you can just
Okay.
cue me when to switch those slides.
Okay. So I am sending it right now.
Perfect.
I'm wondering, does this have to do with speaker view? I'm going to try this again.
Okay. Yeah, you could try your views. That could change it.
That didn't change it.
I've got it here, so I'm going to go ahead and share it. Just let me get this opened. There we go. All righty.
There we are. And now can you go to the full screen? It should be bottom right.
There we go.
This is different. Aha. Okay.
Okay.
So, Jody, I'll just nod to you. You
Okay.
know, okay?
That'll work.
So here we are. Starting again, a toolkit for promoting your own healing. That's certainly my intention here. The next slide is just a cartoon which shows someone at TSA airport security with a whole bunch of bottles and extracts, etc. And the TSA person says, Lyme disease, huh? I'll just mention this. This is exactly what my wife goes through every time we travel. Okay, next slide. I want to talk about the seed and the soil, okay? The seed is the bug, the soil is our response to the bug. In chronic infection, you have to consider both, right? So first we're going to talk about the seed. What's the seed? Well, the germ theory, which is our first so-called scientific explanation of disease, really is only maybe 150 years old. And the I don't know, is it full on your screen right now, Jody? Just because it's not quite on mine, but maybe.
Yes, it is.
Aha, okay, fair enough. So, so basically in the late 1800s, we're looking at the mortality of women with childbed fever. These are women who gave birth and then became septic. And the mortality was really high when doctors delivered babies in the hospital, but it's important to note that before there were such a thing as hospitals and these women delivered at home with midwives helping them, the mortality was low. And then this Dr. Semmelweis, he watched what happened in terms of doctors going to do autopsies and then going to deliver babies and not even washing their hands. And he tracked what was happening. And he tried to convince his colleagues to wash their hands. He didn't know about germs. He just tried to convince them, wash your hands. And he couldn't convince them. He ended up going into an insane asylum and paradoxically, he died of sepsis. That's where we were. And then Louis Pasteur isolates bacteria from the blood of women with postnatal sepsis. You know, we had seen these bacteria. Van Leeuwenhoek back in the 16 or 1700s saw these little things. No one knew what they were. Well, Louis Pasteur made a connection and said, whoa, this is what's making people sick. And then Robert Koch, in pretty definitive test, he isolated the tuberculosis germ from people. He injected them into guinea pigs who then died of TB. Next slide. So basically, can we get the next slide? There we go. So that's the germ, you know, finally we have this explanation. Here's why people get sick. But even then, there were people who were saying, wait a minute, it's not just the germ. Robert Virchow in particular headed this line of thought, and he claimed it wasn't the germ that made people sick, it was the condition of the host. And representative of that is the fact that basically everyone in Europe in the 1800s had tuberculosis. Everyone was affected, but it was only those people who were stressed, had some impairment of their immunity, come in different shapes and forms. They're the ones whose activation became infected and developed active tuberculosis. Pasteur then rethinks what's happening. He goes to the, I guess it was the France medical convention in Paris, and he shows up with two birds, and he said, I injected both of these with anthrax. Bird number one was housed in a warm pen. He was alive, healthy, clucking. Bird number two, underfed, and exposed to cold, and quite dead. And this famous pronouncement from Louis Pasteur, La terrain is everything. Well, so he's jumped to the other side of the coin, but it's not everything. It's both the seed and the soil. Next slide. What we're talking about today is the soil. So I'm very grateful to Joe Birascano and all these others who've increased our knowledge and awareness of the seeds, but we don't talk that much about the soil. That's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, in the next slide, Joe mentioned this. You know, everybody's different. Sometimes I get asked, how do you treat Lyme disease? And what I say is, I don't treat Lyme disease, I treat people. They're all different. And here's just some of the reasons how we differ. In our genetics and biochemical individuality, epigenetics, these are changes in the genetics that can be transferred just from one generation to the next. Previous infections. Do you have indolent Epstein-Barr, for example? Diet, nutrition, obviously, exposure to mold and other allergens, exposure to toxins, mold toxins, heavy metals, other toxins. Lifestyle issues, stress, sleep, socialization, screen time, exercise, adverse childhood experiences. I will go into that in more detail. Adverse adult experiences. Doesn't help if, you've suffered significant trauma in a car accident, for example. Okay, next slide. And so I want to talk about the mind-body connection. How do we understand it? Well, do factors impacting the mind impact the physical body? Yes. I mean, it took a while for Western medicine to figure this out, but it's now generally accepted that people who are stressed in any assortment of ways, it can affect us physically with all sorts of different illnesses. Does physical illness impact mental health? So this is the opposite direction. Well, it's generally accepted that if you're really sick, it can make you depressed or anxious. Okay, but we in the Lyme community know that these infections can impact your mental health directly via neuroinflammation. So then the question is, can we use the mind to influence our physiology, our response to these infections? Next slide. So what happens with stress? And when I say stress, this can be stress from an infection. It can be stress by being attacked by a mountain lion. It can be everything in between. Okay, in the next slide, I'm going to talk about, nope, that one.
There we go, sorry.
So stress stimulates the autonomic nervous system. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, think automatic nervous system. You don't have to think about how fast your heart beats. You don't have to think about where the blood should go. You don't have to think about how fast to breathe or how deep to breathe. Basically, the autonomic nervous system takes care of it, which is good. If we had to remember to breathe, we'd be in trouble. Okay, so there's different arms of the immune system. There's the sympathetic arm, parasympathetic arm, and enteric arm, I just want to say I'm not going to be talking about the enteric arm. I'm going to be talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is mainly stimulatory. This is the accelerator, and it's most famous for when it hits the adrenal medulla. When that's stimulated, it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline and noradrenaline, and we get the fight or flight response. It also affects the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and we have increased cortisol under sympathetic stress. And this is really important. The sympathetic arm is pro-inflammatory. It increases inflammation. You're under stress, guess what? It's going to increase inflammation. The parasympathetic arm can oppose the sympathetic arm. So we have now a brake. The whole point is that if we have an accelerator and we have a brake, the point of the autonomic nervous system is to keep us in homeostasis. So the parasympathetic arm is relaxing or calming, and it is anti-inflammatory. Okay, next slide. So I'm not going to go through the slide. I just want to point out that the autonomic nervous system, we're hitting all the organs, everything in the body. You know, we're only going to be talking about a little piece of it, but it's everything. Everything is regulated to some degree by the autonomic nervous system. Okay, next slide. So the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve. The cranial nerve comes off of cranial nerves, in all of them, they come off the brain, whereas other nerves come off the spinal cord. The vagus nerve is the 10th, and it is the main contributor to the parasympathetic nervous system. It is afferent, which means it actually delivers feedback from the heart, lungs, and gut to the brain, but it is also efferent, which is that it's stimulating the body, and in that sense opposes the sympathetic nervous system. As I mentioned before, it's calming. So when the parasympathetic nervous system gets involved, it lowers heart rate, lowers blood pressure, dilates blood vessels, dilates bronchioles to breathe deeper. It's calming, and it is anti-inflammatory. We'll talk about that a little more as well. The obvious take home here is parasympathetic is good. Okay, next. However, there's two branches of the vagus nerve, and this comes under the headline of polyvagal theory. So it turns out that what we associate with parasympathetic activity really has to do with the ventral vagal arm or branch of the vagus nerve. So this is the parasympathetic calming I've been talking about, whereas sympathetic is sometimes referred to in its innervation with causing fight or flight. Sometimes this is referred to as tend and befriend. By tend, I mean you take care of yourself, you take care of your kids, and if there's a threat, you try to befriend them rather than fight or flee. Okay, so what does that mean? It means social engagement, connection with face and heart, which, you know, because these are expressions of engaging with people around us. However, the dorsal vagal complex has a very different effect. It leads to freeze or paralysis. This is suddenly people, you know, deer in headlights, okay? When people experience this, they can't react well. They go into deep depression. They feel disconnected. They feel hopeless. It's surrender. They want to hide under the covers and not come out. This is the dorsal vagus, okay? So next slide. Here we have, I'm going to show you a series of slides. There'll be huge redundancy, but I'm really trying to drive this home. So you can see that the ventral vagus nerve is, you know, basically encourages social engagement, whereas the dorsal vagus immobility, and then there's the fight and flight, the sympathetic nervous system. So that's the three-part autonomic nervous system. Next slide. And here you see, you can also see this sort of from an evolutionary standpoint. On the left, we see immobilization, we freeze. And, this is what reptiles do. This is a very low on our evolutionary tree that in terms of reactivity. The next level would be, whoa, there's danger, let's get out of the way. But further up on the evolutionary tree is our ability to feel calm and connected and engage socially. Next. And here it is again. I mentioned that I'm repeating myself, but it's the same things, start at the bottom, immobilization, despair, hopeless, collapse. Whereas sympathetic, stress, anxiety, fight, flight, conflict. And then there's the ventral vagus, social engagement, feeling safe, calm, regulated, balanced, resourceful, resourced. Okay, next. And so we just went through past, you're gonna have to go backwards again. This is one more slide. And it just basically, each slide was to give you just a few more details of what this looks like, with the freeze, dissociation, numbness, depression, helpless, shame, shutdown, hopeless, wanting to die, feeling trapped, and then sympathetic, rage, anger, irritation, frustration, panic, fear, etc. And then social engagement, feeling grounded, compassion, curious, open, connected. Okay. I promise not to repeat it anymore. Next slide. Now I want to talk about trauma. What's trauma? Well, trauma I'm calling stress on steroids. It's not just, oh boy, I have an exam tomorrow. Trauma is big time stress. Next slide. So trauma, no surprise, dysregulates the psychoneuroimmune endocrine system. So believe it or not, I did not make that up. Those who've been around for a while are aware of the term psychoneuroimmunology because it's very clear that what we feel from a mood perspective affects our nervous system and immune system, and they're really not disconnected, but it's been expanded. It affects our endocrine system too. And guess what? They're not separate systems at all. This is all part of one big interconnected function in our bodies. So when trauma dysregulates this system, we see dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, what we've just been talking about. And these are common sequelae of that: mood instability, hypervigilance, is it safe? Inflammation, remember, pro-inflammatory, immune suppression, and post-traumatic stress disease. This is a quote from Bessel van der Kolk: trauma radically changes people that in fact they are no longer themselves, or at least who they thought to be. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about Bessel van der Kolk. So Dr. van der Kolk is a psychiatrist. He was at Harvard back when I was in Massachusetts practicing then. Coincidentally, I knew his wife and kids, but I've never met him. And he has written an enormous amount and has taught an enormous amount about the effects of trauma, particularly childhood trauma. Now, what was very interesting to me is that at the time in my medical practice, I treated a lot of people with environmental illness. We had a large clinic, we had full spectrum allergy testing, et cetera. And it became clear to me that there was a certain connection between those who had the most severe environmental illness and a childhood history of trauma. So again, severe environmental illness, these are people who were reduced to eating only a handful of foods, who had severe multiple chemical sensitivities, could not go into public places because a whiff of perfume was enough to give them migraine for a day. And talking with these people suffering from this level of sensitivities, a preponderance of them at that time had histories of childhood abuse. And interesting, while I hadn't met Dr. van der Kolk, I heard lectures he gave in which he said, these people with trauma, that childhood trauma, they develop a lot of physical problems. We were seeing, in essence, the same people coming at it from the two different directions, he from the psychiatric and myself from the organic. But basically, it was all connected. And here's how we connect it, that trauma leading to, boundary issues, what's safe, what's not safe, leads to hypervigilance. Just, you can imagine that someone who grew up in an environment that wasn't safe is always looking out for what's going to happen next, who's coming through the door, etc. Hypervigilance in the nervous system translates to hypervigilance in the in our immune systems. Remember, these are really not separate systems. It's all interconnected. So what happens when our immune systems are hypervigilant? More inflammation, multiple sensitivities, and environmental illness. I wrote about this back then, and I had other practitioners contacting me saying they were seeing the same connection between severe environmental illness and significant childhood trauma. So Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called Your Body Keeps the Score. It is a fantastic book. I can't recommend it enough if you're interested in reading about trauma, childhood trauma in particular, but not only childhood trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so the next slide, we're going to talk about PTSD. So the concept of PTSD was first developed to describe a syndrome soldiers experienced during war-related trauma. Back in World War I, this was described, it was called shell shock. There are genetic and epigenetic risk factors to PTSD. Something occurs, something occurs, and it undermines a basic sense of, am I safe? Am I secure? And PTSD results in dysregulation of the limbic system, which is our emotional brain. It goes a bit haywire. Okay, next slide. Okay, what does it do exactly? PTSD causes hyperactivation of some brain structures while others become hypoactive. So the hippocampus, which stores memories, it shrinks and it distorts the memory, including causing dissociative flashbacks. The amygdala becomes overly reactive. Amygdala is sometimes referred to as the heart of the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, and that leads to this autonomic response. It also releases norepinephrine in the brain, which causes tremendous anxiety. Meanwhile, the medial prefrontal cortex, that's the gray matter, which, remember, it evolved later than the limbic system. It takes longer for information to get there, and it has inhibitory control over the amygdala. But with PTSD, it becomes smaller and less reactive, and it fails to modulate a response to perceived threat. So think about that. If you're reasonably calm, cool, collected, and someone does something threatening, and you have good resources, you don't suffer from PTSD, the prefrontal cortex will say, okay, what's my best way of dealing with this? Versus someone with a significant history of trauma who may very well freak out. Okay, next slide. So this is from Dr. Robert Bransfield. Joe made reference to Dr. Bransfield. He's written more about neuropsychiatric Lyme than anybody. He's fantastic. And this is from a talk that he gave. And I just want to point out that if we go to the left and see an external danger, that it results in fear, appropriate fear, response circuits, what do we do to deal with this threat? And we're on the wrong slide, there we are. And if you're well-resourced and you're able to deal with the threat, you adapt, you're good. You don't get PTSD. But let's say you don't have an ability to respond to this threat. It's something out of your control that can lead to PTSD. Well, PTSD can lead to inflammation and autoimmunity. I already talked about the physiology of PTSD and how it affects our nervous system and so on. We'll talk about that more. So all that leads to multiple psychiatric and somatic symptoms. Sound familiar? Well, it's the same thing that happens. Look at the right-hand side of this. Internal danger, which would be like tick-borne infections, which we need a good immune system to deal with it. But let's say it's overwhelming infection and we don't get proper treatment for it. Well, the same thing. It goes to persistent inflammation, autoimmunity, and guess what? That in itself can then trigger the limbic system, PTSD, and we got a snowball going here. On the other hand, if we do get appropriate diagnosis and treatment when we get infected, we can adapt and boom, we can stay healthy. Okay, next slide. So here it is again, PTSD dysregulates the psychoneuroimmune endocrine system. Endocrine is bolded because that's what this slide is about. Basically, distortions in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the autonomic nervous system, hormone dysregulation. So we see not only release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, fight or flight, heart rate, blood pressure, arousal, startle response, but abnormal cortisol regulation. So now we have immune dysregulation and even resistance to receptors to cortisol, leading to increased inflammation. Next slide. And now we're going to talk about effects on the nervous system, but you know, you can see how you really can't separate these out. This is all happening simultaneously. So what do we see in the nervous system? Well, there's an increase in glutamate. This is in the brain, which fosters dissociation and derealization. You know, think of what happens to people whose dorsal vagus is stimulated and they go into that paralysis place. An increase in brain norepinephrine, I mentioned this before, generates fear and anxiety. A decrease in GABA activity. Remember, GABA is an inhibitory neuropeptide. It is normally calming, but there's a decrease in that activity. And as I've already mentioned, activation of the autonomic nervous system. Next slide. And here's what happens with immune dysregulation. So PTSD results in a hyperinflammatory state. There is an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines, a decrease in anti-inflammatory cytokines, and an increase in autoimmunity. So there's a suppression of immune function. And as I mentioned previously, hyperinflammatory responses and hypervigilance lead to increased sensitivities. And then summing it up, hyperinflammatory states lead to multiple somatic and psychiatric symptoms that may further trigger PTSD. Okay, so now we have this cycle of inflammation and symptoms. Next slide. So, you know, this is a summary. What we see is dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, a lot of mood instability, hypervigilance, inflammation, multiple sensitivities, immune suppression, hormone imbalances. Basically, PTSD impacts our sense of self in the world, of who we are. Like, am I safe? Am I loved? Is the world safe, etc. Okay, next slide. So childhood trauma is PTSD on steroids. So PTSD is a big category, can manifest many different ways. And I just want to point out that when terrible things happen to an adult, like say a war vet from Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, or a rape victim, God forbid, or someone in an absolutely terrible car accident, these can easily generate PTSD. Childhood trauma is different. And here's what's different. Those people who suffered it as an adult, hopefully they had a reasonable enough childhood that they have some resilience and they have some resources and they have a sense of who they are, that they developed a strong sense of self and safety in the world and what they can do. When one experiences significant trauma as a child, it's, who knows what's safe? People are supposed to be safe or not safe. What's a healthy boundary when people who are supposed to love you unconditionally instead can be violent and so on? I mean, you get the idea. So in the next slide, this is started off with a famous study. It was done at Kaiser about adverse childhood experiences, which generates the so-called ACE scores, okay? So what they did was they actually looked at 17,000 people, adults, and they asked them to fill out a questionnaire. Did they have any of these adverse experiences that are listed here? And then they compared their medical charts in terms of their physical illnesses. Okay, it's a given that people with significant ACE scores are going to have much higher preponderance of psychiatric issues, whether it's anxiety, depression, or suicidality for that matter. But we're looking at physical problems now, okay? I'm just going to read these for the record. Psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional and or physical neglect, loss of a parent for any reason, a mother treated violently, substance abuse, mental illness, criminal behavior in the household. So these are things that happened in your family of origin. Okay, in the next slide, I just want to show you something. This is really amazing. So if someone had an ACE score of 2, just 2, the increased risk of hospitalization for autoimmune diseases, it's an increase of 70 to 80%. Now, that doesn't mean you have a 70 to 80% chance of being hospitalized for an autoimmune disease. It means you have an increase of 70, 80%. In other words, it goes up from 1% to say 1.75%. That's a huge increase. And for every increase in the ACE score of 1 point, from 3 to 4 to 5, the risk of developing an autoimmune disease, such as type 1 diabetes, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and many others, each step it goes up 20%. And I need to remind you, Lyme disease complex is an autoimmune illness. Joe just gave a wonderful talk on Bartonella, which causes more autoimmunity than any microbe that I've experienced. Okay, next slide. And just to point out, ACE score and risk for other chronic illnesses that they've looked at. That top line, it's now this is with a score of 4 or more. There's a 4 times higher risk of lung disease, 2.2 times higher risk of heart disease, almost 2% higher risk, not 2%, 2 times higher risk of cancer, 1.6 times higher risk of diabetes. You see my point, trauma affects our physical bodies, childhood trauma even more so. Next slide. And PTSD is not only in victims of obvious trauma. So think about, maybe these have happened to you, chronic pain symptoms that cannot be controlled, chronic illness without explanation, chronic neuropsychiatric and somatic symptoms that make it hard to cope, negative encounters with physicians who are arrogant, ignorant, contemptuous, and dismissive, neglect and isolation, chronic inflammation and autoimmunity. Sound familiar? I think all of us who've experienced Lyme disease complex are acquainted with these kinds of traumas. Next slide. So let's put it together. Lyme disease complex and PTSD. I'll just remind you that I use the term Lyme disease complex. I explain this in my book because once we're talking about chronic Lyme, it's not just Lyme. As Joe pointed out, we're talking about Lyme plus co-infections. We're also talking about all this dysregulation in the nervous, immune, endocrine system, and so on. So what do we know? Lyme itself can be traumatic and cause PTSD for all those reasons in the previous slide. Lyme disease complex and PTSD result in the same overlapping pathophysiology. What do we see in Lyme disease complex? The same dysregulation that I described in people who suffer PTSD in the nervous, endocrine, and immune systems. And Lyme disease complex can directly result in activation of the limbic system. And there it is. There's your PTSD. Next slide. So Lyme disease and complex and PTSD are all the result of trauma, leading it to changes in who you believe yourself to be, like Bessel van der Kolk described. For example, do you think of yourself as, I'm a worthy person, I deserve good things, I'm lovable, people like me, I feel secure and safe, or not? Do you feel like you're worthless? Do you feel like there's nothing about you that is lovable? Do you think you're not a good person? Do you feel like there's nothing about you that is safe? And then what about the outside world? How do you perceive the universe? Is the outside world safe, or is it in fact hostile or dangerous? Is it supportive or basically not caring? I mean, we could go down a whole list. So what I want to point out is that PTSD pre-existing Lyme disease complex will make symptoms and treatment more challenging. Okay, next slide. And here we have Dr. Bransfield's slide again. And I'm just reminding you how, the external danger might be what happened when people grew up and had childhood trauma, but it can also be, adult trauma and the fear response circuits leading to PTSD symptoms, and then combine that with tick-borne infections, immune system problems with inflammation, autoimmunity, and wow, it's a perfect storm. Okay, next slide. So here's a story. What happens if you get attacked by a mountain lion? Those of us in Colorado probably all know this story. This happened, I think, around 2019. There was this dude, he was probably around 30-something years old, and he's basically jogging or running outside of Fort Collins, Colorado. He hears this clip-clop behind him, and suddenly he's attacked by a mountain lion. Yeah, these things don't happen too often, but here's what happened. So first he had to get the claws off his face. And then there's an interview with him, and excuse me, so I went ahead and wrote a link here to the interview. There's an interview with him that I watched, and he's calm, cool, collected, but he's not bragging or anything. He's just being normal. He said, well, what happened was, I remembered that, I had cats when I was a kid, and we used to play with the cats, and when they were on their backs, they were helpless. They really couldn't use their bodies to do anything. So after getting the claws off my face, I wrestled this mountain lion onto its back, and then I strangled it to death. Wow, that's, believe it or not, that's what he did. And in the next slide, you can see a picture of this dude who's got a whole bunch of stitches on his face, but he's actually none the worse for wear. And what I'm pointing out here is this dude was able to deal with the event. Sure, he had an autonomic response, an appropriate one, saying, oh my God, I'm in danger. And then he was able, thank God, to deal with it. He's not going to have PTSD. Not only that, but I can guarantee that this person had a good enough childhood that he did not grow up as a victim, that he did not grow up as helpless, but rather empowered. That he has a sense of self as safe and secure and able to handle things. Thank God. Okay, next slide. So here it is. Again, this dude from Fort Collins on the left, external danger, fear response circuits, and then adapts to the danger. No PTSD. He's good. Next slide. So how do we heal? Okay. This is not easy. I think we can all agree on that. And I'm going to break it down. So in the next slide, Jody, there we go. I want to talk about the mind-body universe. So the mind, I'm referring to the mind not as our thoughts. This is what I'm thinking right now. It's our belief systems about ourselves. I made reference to this before. Who do we believe ourselves to be, and how do we believe the world will be in response to that? Okay. You know, are we inherently safe and secure, or do we feel vulnerable and in danger? Do we see the world as hostile or caring and supportive? Okay. The mind actually, it holds a template. Our belief systems hold a template for our emotional body, which is also the world of energy, the world of feelings. And that in turn holds the template for the physical body, the world of action. All these worlds are all here right now. The next slide. Jody, the next slide. There we go. No, we missed a slide, I think. We missed a bunch of slides. So back it up. Okay, try again. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, let's start off with the world of physicality and doing. Well, you've heard all about these things. I just listed them here. We need to acknowledge the problem. We got to make a diagnosis, right? Excuse me. And I want to point out that in some patients, in some patients, it's medications to help stabilize our nervous system and our mood issues are important. I can tell you when I had severe anxiety with panic attacks, severe depression in which I thought about suicide on a daily basis, medications were important, okay? This was not a time when I could deal with, say, childhood trauma or relationship issues. This was basically, I just needed some sort of stabilization to get through the day and not want to kill myself, okay? So it's very important. It's very important in that stage to use medications and or supplements for calming, mood stabilization, pain, and sleep. And I'll just point out that sometimes the best thing we can do then is also just plain old distraction, you know, binging on TV, if that's what it takes, or, you know, reading books, whatever. You know, I think I read the Fellowship of the Ring trilogy twice. Okay. What else? Decrease ongoing negative stimuli, environmental triggers, which include foods, chemicals, and mold, avoiding toxic exposures, toxic people, toxic relationships, avoid the news if it's upsetting. And we all know there's pretty upsetting news out there. These are all things you know: diet, exercise, sunlight, antimicrobials, of course, as tolerated, balancing hormones, supporting the immune system, detoxification. Joe went through these as well. These are things you know about. This is actually not what we're talking about today. In the next slide, we're going to talk about the world of emotions and energy. And basically, this is really about incorporating activities to enhance the ventral branch of the parasympathetic nervous system. Excuse me. I don't know if this is totally inclusive, but it was everything I could think of: meditation, relaxation, deep breathing, mindfulness, yoga, qigong, tai chi, body work like massage and craniosacral work, biofeedback, acupuncture, body work, EMDR, polyvagal exercises. These are 2 books on polyvagal exercise, Anchored by Deb Dana and Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve by Steve Rosenberg. Tapping on acupressure points. It's called Emotional Freedom Technique. It has other names like thought field therapy and Callahan technique. Music, chanting, dance, rituals, equine therapy. The point is there's no one avenue to take. We have a potpourri, and some things work for some people, some things work for others. Okay, support is important for everyone. You don't do this by yourself. You need to be connected. So whether that's groups or just individuals that you're talking with are important. Talk psychotherapy can be very important to get that kind of support. And body-centered psychotherapy, which is to help people really feel into themselves and also to help move trauma out of the body. And finally, MDMA, you know, that's ecstasy, right? Now there are studies, and in fact, one of them I think is I think the primary investigators in Boulder or Longmont, it's anticipated that MDMA will be approved by the FDA next year for the treatment of PTSD. Has had a very high success rate. And what we're talking about, this is not a hallucinogen. This is a modality that helps people in a very safe space with a very good therapist guide relive their trauma in a non-traumatic way, and eventually being able to say, you know, that happened then, but this is now, and not be feeling like that trauma was still happening in their bodies. It's putting it in the past and then feeling the present. In the next slide, we talk about the mind. Okay, again, this is the world of belief systems. And here we're trying to actually desensitize the limbic system, which is so trigger happy and just goes nuts when something happens that somehow feels or sounds or smells like some trauma. Okay, so there's two programs, DNRS, Dynamic Neural Retraining System, and the Gupta protocol that seek to do this. I'll come back to describe them. Excuse me, they basically have to do with imprinting, you know, positivity instead of the negative trauma. I need to point out that in order to do these programs, you need access to childhood scissors or to trauma scissors. That is, if those feelings come up of that terrible car accident, the terrible rape, or the terrible childhood trauma, you need to be able to say, no, I'm not going there. You need to be able to edit it. You need to be able to switch the channels from a bad memory to a good one, even if you make it up. The point is that people who have a really strong PTSD, they're not ready to do this work. This is just on another level. Because in order for this to work, you really need to be able to cut off those negative feelings. In the next slide, there are other ways that this works. Plant medicine. So Psilocybin Lsd, these are hallucinogens. There are a lot of studies, mainly with psilocybin. So the reason psilocybin is studied more than LSD is because a typical psilocybin journey is 4 or 5 hours, and LSD is like 6 to 8 hours. So if you're going to do a study, you want to do something that doesn't take that long a time. But we're talking about, again, guided journeys that help, in this case, you know, really help see them people in the world all by themselves. You know, this is interesting. I'll just mention that when I was a medical student, which goes back to the early 70s, in neuroscience class, they showed us a video of an individual giving LSD to people with terminal cancer and sitting with them during a journey, being a guide, holding their hands. And when they came through the other end, these people were no longer afraid of dying. It felt like they had gone through a death process, and they felt now, you know, there was nothing to be afraid of, and their hearts were wide open. What was being done then is now being reproduced now in major medical centers like NYU and Johns Hopkins. Other studies using these modalities have worked with depression, they've worked with addiction disorders, and so on. I highly recommend Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. He's an excellent writer, and he does great research, and he describes how these things work. I want to point out that healing on this level of belief systems will not hold unless healing work is also done on the emotional and physical levels. Some people feel like, oh, you know, if I can change how I believe, then that's going to affect my emotional body, my physical body. And temporarily, that might be true, but it won't hold. So really, folks, we have to work on all these levels. We can't do the so-called spiritual bypassing. Okay, So in the next slide, I talk about dynamic neural retraining system, merely just to say, here's where you can access and learn about it. This is a quote from their website. And basically what she's saying is that it creates structural and functional changes in parts of the brain. We're talking about stabilizing the limbic system, and they're doing research in people on that. In the next slide, I talk about the Gupta program, and he's really doing the same thing. Both these programs take a big commitment. And by that, I mean, they ask you to be doing some work on a daily basis. And so Gupta, Ashok Gupta, he refers to what he does as amygdala and insula retraining, or AIR techniques. Again, he's really desensitizing the amygdala. And he says that they have a clinical audit. We found that 2/3 of their clients reached an 80 to 100% recovery within a year. I know people who've done this, they've had great success. I also know people who've done it for just a month or two and it didn't work. It really takes at least a 6-month commitment. Okay, next slide. Story number 3. Okay, this is my last story, but I think it's a great one. So there's a town in Pennsylvania. It's actually not that far north of where I grew up, which was Allentown, Pennsylvania. Rosetta, Pennsylvania is north of Allentown. It's sort of very close to the Delaware River. And back in the 1960s, actually in 1960, it drew the attention of some epidemiologists and a social worker person from the University of Pennsylvania. And it drew their attention because the incidence of heart disease, which then and now is the most common cause of mortality in the United States, was half the national average. So they went into this town wondering, like, well, what's the story? Are there a whole lot of, vegetarian marathon runners or something like that? Well, back then, these towns could be a predominance of one ethnic group or another. So Rosetta, they were mainly Italians. Other towns might be Welsh or Irish, excuse me. But these people actually were progeny of families who came from Rosetta, Italy, somewhere south of Rome. And when the quarries basically closed up there, they needed to move, and they started coming to the US, and some families came together, and they actually even brought their priest over. So there was this incredibly tight community where people did things together. They all went to the same church. They had tons of meals together. There was like multiple parents to the same kids because there was so much closeness in the community. And, this is a quote from a review on Rosetta, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to read it. Despite a greater prevalence of obesity in Rosetta, yeah, these people are just eating pizza and hanging out on their porches. And despite similar dietary, smoking, and exercise habits and similar ethnic and genetic background, the inhabitants of Rosetta were relatively immune to heart disease at the beginning of the research in 1963. By the way, they were also immune to a lot of other health problems. They were also strikingly tenacious in adhering to old world values and customs. When these traditional values and relationships were abandoned by the rising generation, death rate from heart disease climbed toward the American norm. The investigators that went in there said in 20 years, the rate of heart disease was going to be the same, because they could see what was happening with the next generation who, guess what? They didn't really want to go to church. They didn't want to hang out with their family. They wanted to watch TV and hang out together. They were doing what American kids were doing. The study concluded that unconditional interpersonal support counteracts life stress and thus preserves life. I've just always been moved by what happened in Rosetta, Pennsylvania. And a short personal story is, I would read about this over and over. And one time I said to myself, what was it like? What was it like to live there? And I actually, had this sort of internal vision of myself. I'm standing on a porch of this brick row house. I'm looking out over this town, and I feel like, here's what I felt like, that, oh, I'm just sort of an average bloke. I mean, there's nothing special about me. Some things are pretty good, some things are not so good, but there was an incredible sense of belonging. There was belonging and acceptance. I was a part of this, and there was an unconditionality with it. And I can tell you that the overwhelming sensation in my body was of this deep relaxation and safety. It was amazing. This experience that I had, deep relaxation and safety in community. Okay, next slide. So this is a summary slide. What's it about? Well, the mind and body are aspects of a single universe. And I say manifesting on different vibrational levels. I don't know how else to say it. Vibration doesn't quite make it. The point is, it's all here now, and it's all interconnected. Stabilization of the psychoneuroimmune endocrine system leads to emotional and physical resilience. And this is a quote: "The roots of resilience are to be found in the sense of being understood by and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, and self-possessed other." In other words, healing occurs in relationship. You don't do this by yourself. We need others to hold us in that place of unconditionality. Healing has occurred when an individual experiences safety, real deep internal safety with healthy boundaries. That's it. Thank you very much. And the last slide, I just want to thank Robert Bransfield, because I used some of his slides in this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Yeah, so far we don't